Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we speak to Professor Mike Berners Lee. During the interview, we explore what is meant by the polycrisis, the role of power, and how, in the face of huge challenge, we must look for opportunity. Good evening, Chloe.
Hello, Tom.
Just another fantastic conversation we've got coming up. I couldn't be happier with the kind of guests we're getting on, the topics we're covering. This is a term, the polycrisis is something we didn't even know existed at the start of the Wilder podcast. So it really is feeling like we're evolving and learning and broadening our horizons, however terrifying, in order to better understand the challenges that we face.
And that's the whole point of the podcast, isn't it? To take people on the journey that we've been on. And that journey is not just one of understanding rewilding or regenerative food production, but it's also one very much of understanding the broader context. And this is very much a zoomed out conversation. But perhaps before we get too much into the detail of the interview, we should introduce ourselves and a little bit about the Grange Project.
Yeah, so we are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife, and we launched the Grange Project 2.5 years ago. Kind of our response to our growing understanding of the challenges that our planet faces just through, at that stage, was just the climate crisis. And we felt, as we just had children, we probably should try and do what we could in order to mitigate the effects and help to educate, influence and learn more about it. So we've got the Grange Project, which is a nature restoration site just outside Monmouthshire, where we're looking to explore ways in which we help protect more nature. We'll look to produce as many, if not more, hopefully eventually, human edible calories as was being produced previously on the land. We look to help drive kind of local economies and local employment by having ecopreneur businesses based on site. And finally, to connect more people to the land, absolutely fundamental if we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in.
And as well as some interviews with some fantastic guests, we also give a little update about what's been happening in the project since the preceding episode. And this week, we've got two quite significant updates that I think really reflect how far we've come and critically how far rewilding in Wales has come since we started this journey.
Fire away.
So the first is that over the last 9 months, we have been working in collaboration with some other amazing organisations. And just yesterday, we launched the Welsh Rewilding Alliance.
Da-da-da.
It feels really apt that we've been able to launch this month, giving Tir na Tir's big announcement of their land purchase. And it feels like a pivotal time for rewilding in Wales. If you're interested and want to find out more, you can go to our website, just search Welsh Rewilding Alliance. And there's a fantastic report. I really encourage you to read it. It's been beautifully produced. It's a lovely thing graphically. And the words are composed by John Moses. He's a fantastic author. And it's called A Welsh Way to Wild. And it's a treat to read.
Come on, sell it to me, Chloe. What's actual? If I'm listening, I'm in Wales. I want to know more about sell this report to me more. What's it actually? What am I going to learn from it?
I'm feeling a lot of pressure to do John's wonderful report justice, but essentially it sets some of the historical and cultural context around rewilding in Wales. It provides some excellent arguments for the value of this land management approach and the impact it's going to have for both nature and people. And it shares some fantastic stories and case studies of where nature restoration in Wales is already happening.
Cool. Links will be in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn more about that. Come on then, number 2 update, what is it?
Well, this is slightly more relevant to the Grange Project, which is, again, after quite a long process, we have been officially awarded a certificate to show that we are on the Naturva pathway. Sorry if I've butchered the Welsh to anyone that's listening, which effectively means we've been recognised as an OECM, which is another effective area-based conservation measure.
Okay, cool. Is this like the equivalent of the 5-meter badge in swimming, or is this quite unique? And what does it actually mean?
Well, it means that the site here has been recognised as a piece of land that is working really hard to restore nature and has good enough governance that we can be confident that we're actually going to improve the biodiversity across the landscape. And that means that hopefully in the long term, we're on a pathway to be recognised under Wales's 30 by 30 targets, which is essentially a global target to be protecting 30% of the land's and the sea's surface for biodiversity.
We get any money yet?
Patience. I don't know. It's a case study. We're experimenting.
We've got a certificate to laminate, or maybe not laminate. That might not be good for the environment. But to stick up in the hub.
It's signed by the Deputy First Minister.
Is it actually signed though, or is it electronically signed?
I don't know.
But no, look, I know that a lot of effort has gone on in the background. We have to write a lot of governance and documentation to get this certificate. So I jest, well done, Chloe, because you did most of that work. And it is really cool. And it'd be interesting to see where this kind of takes us.
And I think the exciting bit about it is that the Welsh Government is recognising rewilding and nature restoration as a process to restore biodiversity.
Cool. Right, you ready to get depressed?
And equally hopeful, maybe not equally hopeful, a little bit hopeful.
This interview, which is what I'm referring to, is, like I said, again, up there with the most important, probably, interviews you'll hear in your lifetime. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it's really important to understand it. I think it's a really good foundation episode to understand the complexities of the polycrisis, which I won't go into now because that's pretty much what we cover in the interview. And Mike's ability to communicate that in a way that is equal parts authoritative, engaging, and hopeful, I think is second to none. For me, these are the kind of episodes that I absolutely love because it's really important to not get wrapped upon too much about let's protect one certain animal. We've got to really be stepping back and going, come on, what's going on more broadly? How does that intermingle and affect each other? And we've got to start dealing with it on a more systemic, global level.
And Mike does not minimise the need for us all to step up. And I think that's critical, actually, because if you just listen to it without that call for action, you might end up feeling a bit flat and hopeless and lost about what we can do. But what Mike does so effectively is direct you to steps you can take, from really small, manageable, achievable ones you can do in 10 seconds through to perhaps much more significant ones, which I think is a necessary complement to some of the dark pictures that he paints.
My guess is this is the kind of podcast that you're going to be sending to your friends and family to get them genned up on the importance of the polycrisis. But without further ado, let's get into it.
So hello, Mike, and welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Well, it's wonderful to be here.
And it's equally wonderful to have you with us on the podcast today. And I think particularly because your writing has played such a critical role in our own journey. For those that might not be familiar with Tom and my story, following the birth of our first child in 2018, we decided to rather naively Google climate change and check that someone was on it. And part of that research involved reading Mike's book, There Is No Planet B. And we found it both, I guess, really powerful and also incredibly accessible, which at that time of our lives was really critical. So I actually bought 10 copies and gave it to all my family and friends.
You did.
So a big thank you for your work and also for your latest book, A Climate of Truth, which is an equally important contribution to our thinking about how we move forward together. But maybe to those few that might not be familiar with who you are, Mike, I wonder if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners.
Okay, well, I've got a few different hats, I suppose. I'm a professor at Lancaster University. I run a business called Small World Consulting that helps organizations to respond to what I would describe as, today's biggest challenges, namely the polycrisis, which we'll talk about in a second. And every now and again, I write books. So as you say, most recently, A Climate of Truth, which is, I'm always looking for the point of greatest leverage, really. I suppose over the years, my journey has tried to ask sort of deeper questions into what are the reasons behind the reasons why we're not really getting anywhere. Because if we can maybe stand back a bit further and get a new perspective on it, we can find some point of leverage which will enable us to be radically more effective in our attempts to create a better world than we've been managing to date.
I'm conscious that I've got a couple of really good friends, and they both have families, kids at the same age. I would say they've got more than a couple of brain cells to rub together. And I've been struggling to get them to engage with this conversation, with the journey that Chloe and I are on. And mainly probably because I can't articulate it well enough. Like, what is the polycrisis? So we've mentioned it a few times already. Would you mind maybe focusing on my two good friends, to explain to them why they should maybe sit up and listen to what the polycrisis is?
Okay, so we hear from time to time about climate change, and sometimes it's more appropriately described as a climate crisis. But what's clear is that if we really want to deal with the climate crisis, we have to see it in a bigger context. It's actually just one symptom of something much bigger that's going on for humanity at the moment. It's a symptom of the fact that the whole way we're living is not fit for the context we're in. And the context we're in is that we have become an incredibly powerful species compared to the fragile planet we're on. So we've been getting more powerful for millennia. But what's happened recently is we've suddenly become so powerful that we are the biggest thing affecting the ecosystem by a very long way. And every year we get more powerful still. And we do that through a rising energy supply and rising technology to do ever more things with that energy supply. And it's taken us into, I'll use a big word, an era called the Anthropocene, right? Which I just used to mean it's the era in which we're the big thing affecting the ecosystem. And that's a brand new context for us to be in. And most of our economics, the way we run society, the way we think about politics, the way we run our businesses, all of that, broadly speaking, has been honed in a pre-Anthropocene context in which the world was a big, robust place. If we wanted more of something, then it was just up to us to find a way of digging it out of the ground, and that would be fine. And if we had an experiment and it went wrong and we made a mess, it was kind of broadly speaking okay because the world could put itself back together again. And those days are over. And we've had a few decades of being in the Anthropocene and being able to live as if we're not in it. But what's critical about right now is if we can't make a transition to an Anthropocene fit way of carrying ourselves, we are going to get into an awful lot of trouble. In fact, we're going into that incredible trouble right now. So the climate crisis is one symptom of that, but it's only one symptom. So when we say polycrisis, it's because just as serious as the climate dimension to it, there's a nature crisis. We're hemorrhaging our biodiversity at the moment with huge implications for things like our food supply, the whole health of humanity. It's easy to think of nature as, oh, well, nature's just that sort of pretty stuff and we could live without it a bit. We can't. We actually can't survive without it for all kinds of complex reasons. It's not just climate and nature. I mean, related to that, we've got pollution crisis, not least plastics. If you look at the growth rate on plastic production, it's frighteningly high. It's like 4 or 5% a year. We're doubling the amount of plastic in the world every 15 years. And it's turning up in our organs, in our bodies. It's turning up in breast milk. It's turning up in the brains of unborn babies. And we don't have any idea how to ever get it out of the ecosystem. And it's disrupting our endocrine system, which is our hormone management system. So all these things are coming together. And it's kind of not just that. It's affecting food security. It's got health implications. There are disease threats. Some of those disease threats are coming from pollution. Some of them are coming from climate change. Some of them are coming from some of the ways in which we're doing our food system, which is creating opportunities for diseases to jump from animals to humans. So there's all these things going on and more together, and they all interact with each other. It doesn't work to deal with them one at a time. It's a systemic problem. And there's some really good news about it, actually, which is that from a technical perspective, we can deal with it all. We can do an energy transition. We know how to cut the fossil fuel use. We know how to sort out a much, much more sustainable food system. But the weird thing is that despite the crystal clear evidence of how urgent it is, and despite the technical know-how and opportunity to sort it out, we're just not doing it. So there's a kind of I've described so far very briefly the outer layer of this polycrisis, but then so one layer underneath that is, what would it take to change? What kind of new economics might we need? What kind of new way of doing politics? Can we deal with this stuff without dealing with inequality, because actually we need to cooperate at a global level in a way we've never managed to do before? What about our relationship with technology? We need in some ways, a new relationship with technology, because at the moment we invent a technology and we sort of put it into a free market, a broadly speaking free market, and somebody adopts that technology because it gives an efficiency improvement, and then everybody needs to adopt it. Otherwise they get left behind. And now humanity's got this technology, and nobody's actually made a conscious decision, is this fundamentally good for people and planet? We just kind of, we talk about technology as if we control it, but in a way we don't. And we've got to change that. So there's a kind of a whole depth to this polycrisis. And for me, at the core of it, some stuff about ways we need to think and values that we need to have that will enable us to start living in an Anthropocene fit way. In other words, will enable us to thrive going forwards. So that's my quite long description of the polycrisis. Just to summarize, it's a very systemic thing. It's practically everything about how humans do life needs to change altogether. We can change it. We just haven't worked out how yet.
And where do we start with that? How far back do we start with changing those mindsets? Because again, thinking about my friends, they're very much understandably stuck in the mindset of the previous generation's mindset of must work hard, must be professional, must make money because that's how I demonstrate success. So question one is how far back do you go to start trying to influence that mindset? And then secondly, my question, and they're probably not really particularly very well linked, so apologies for this, but it's where does, in the military, and that's my background, we have the so what question, which is, so you've explained what the polycrisis is, but what's the so what associated with it, with them? For me, it's like geopolitical global instability caused by a lot of this polycrisis. That's one of the things we're going to see that's really affecting us, that you can almost touch and feel in a horrible kind of sense. So where does geopolitical instability sit within the polycrisis?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I'll answer the so what question first, I think, because I think it's easy for many people in this country in particular to kind of think, oh, well, all these things, that's going to be horrible for those people in Africa. But, it's always horrible things have always happened in those parts of the world. We'll be okay. We're in a lovely developed country, an island in a lovely civilized part of the world, all the rest of it, it won't really affect us. Well, that's not how it's going to be. So we just held the national emergency briefing in the Central Hall at Westminster, and we got sort of 85 MPs, but we put them in front of 9 top experts on different elements of the climate and nature crisis. So we talked about a lot of the polycrisis, and what we talked about was not just the global context, but the UK context. We talked about extreme weather wrecking our farming. We talked about food insecurity, absolutely here and now, big deal, and every society is only 9 meals away from anarchy, right? And then we talked about the health implications of all this. And people were expecting to hear about, heat stroke and so on, resulting from freak weather events and so on. We didn't hear that. What we heard was, the economy is in danger of collapsing. And in a collapsed economy, you don't have a proper health service. So people just die of all sorts of things. But then possibly, even more powerfully again, or, maybe equally powerfully, we heard from Lieutenant General Richard Nugey talking about the threat to UK national security right now. And he said, this is huge. And it comes from all kinds of directions. I mean, back to this is such a systemic problem. And he started describing things like, if you get farmers around the world in large quantities who find they can't make a living out of farming anymore, they are extremely susceptible to joining extreme and violent groups. And that has massive implications for us here in the UK. When you get countries that are really having trouble for resources, just to be able to feed themselves, then that, the idea that we're somehow distanced from that, I mean, you haven't got to look that carefully at global politics at the moment to see how fragile the world order that I've known all my life is. So, a bit of imagination required. This is absolutely, we are careering into a situation in which, well, the lovely stability that I've known all my life, which my parents didn't enjoy throughout their lives, I think it's very likely to come to an end. The question is, does it have to come to an end? If it does, can we find a way through it? In how good a shape can we find a way through it? There's so much we can do right now to help us with this. So the so what is, to summarize, if we don't get on top of this polycrisis, it's going to be extremely unpleasant for humanity. I'm not saying nobody's going to get through, but there's not going to be that many of us if we really can't start getting on top of this. So that's the kind of dark side of it. What would it take for us to start getting on top of this? Well, we need to wake up, right? We really need to wake up. And the evidence couldn't be clearer on this. It was very funny at the national emergency briefing. We had 1,000 people in the room, a lot of very influential people. We, as I say, probably about 85 MPs, similar number of peers, business leaders, celebrities, all sorts of people in the room. We sort of selected them for their influence. And we laid out a very, very serious picture. And I asked everybody to put up their hand. Do you think it's if you think it's about as serious as we've laid out, B, if you think there's been some fundamental exaggeration, and see if you think it's even more serious. And I encourage people to be brave and independent-minded and say what they really thought. Not one hand went up in the air to say that it had been exaggerated. Not one. So we all get it, right? As a slightly underrepresented group, but I do this test all the time with business audiences in front of hundreds of blue suits, that have nothing to do with sustainability often, and I get the same result. Not just me, detailed research has gone on around the world looking at this. Humanity wants change. It's just that everybody's waiting for everyone else. So what does it take for us to wake up? Well, and the other thing that was interesting about the National Emergency Briefing is that the more people heard about the mess we're in, the more the level of energy and positive excitement grew in the room. Why was that then? The reason is because I think we know deep down, your friends know deep down that this isn't right. It's just we push it to the back of our minds. But that eats us, actually. We've got this thing, it's nagging us, we're not on it, and we know it's going to be trouble. And it's not possible to be truly happy when you know deep down that you're just not doing what you should be doing. So why the energy was going up in the room was because we were transforming a problem that is too difficult to look at into a problem that we can stare in the face. And, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we in that room, we faced it. And in my books, I try and face it. And I try and face it in a cheerful way, in the sense that there's everything to play for. There's a great deal to play for. I think, I'd be surprised if we don't head to some reasonably dark things in the future, if I'm honest now, because we've been so late off the mark. But there is so much to play for. And when we get on the case, you know what? It will feel brilliant. We will feel such a weight lifted off our shoulders that, almost no matter how bad the situation is, we'll feel good about doing the right thing. So I think what I would say to your friends is to spend time looking at this. Like, you did, you read some books, including mine. Thank you. That's great. The more people think about this, the more they tune into it. But we all have protective mechanisms that protect us from engaging with stuff that is psychologically difficult. And so I would ask everybody to ask themselves what they think their protective mechanisms are and what would it take for them not to need them anymore. And I asked people that questions on those lines at the National Emergency Briefing. And we spent quite a lot of time in the run-up to the briefing thinking about what could be said and how, and what I could say as chair and how, in order to try and remove those barriers, to let everybody, for example, see that everyone in the room was on the same side and they're not alone, right? But also just to encourage some courage. We need to wake up and we need to be brave. All of us need to be brave. We need to go into those business meetings where maybe it's not explicit climate denial, but conversations are being had that are not commensurate with the situation we're in. And we need to be the brave person who stands up and says, this isn't right. We shouldn't be operating like this. This business shouldn't be thinking in this way because we're in a polycrisis and it's really going to come and hit us badly, and soon if we don't get onto it. It takes courage, but my goodness, the chances are you'll be in a room full of people who are quietly thinking deep down, I'm glad somebody else is saying this.
I have so many questions, things I want to comment on. But I think firstly, I just want to start with some appreciation for those that were involved in the National Emergency Briefing and the thought and time that went into hosting that event and some of the videos that have come out subsequently, because we found them incredibly useful and insightful, and we shared them across our networks what we can. But I know these things don't happen easily. So thank you to everyone involved in that endeavour.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story, actually. Simon and Nick Aldridge put up their own money. It was their idea. They organized this. They got the whole thing going. That's why it happened. That was brilliant. And just a quick plug for it. Anybody listening to this, go to nebriefing.org and download the videos. Watch all the briefings. There's a letter that everybody can sign, because the call we're making is to Keir Starmer and all the major broadcasters to have a national information campaign on the nature and climate crisis, because we're not hearing about it properly from the media, not at all. And also ask your MP specifically to sign. There's a letter specifically for MPs, because we want to get a majority of MPs publicly listed up as supporting this. And when we've got that, then surely government can row back from it. So there's actions you can take on the anybriefing.org website. And there are some incredibly powerful talks actually on nature, on climate, on extreme weather, on food, on health, on national security, and some on what needs to happen in our economics, and what an opportunity that is, and also what an opportunity the energy transition is. Because if there was going to be another briefing that we didn't have, and we already had 9, we couldn't really, but there are probably 3 other briefings I would have loved to have been able to squeeze in. But one of them would have been on misinformation, because a running thread through the briefing is, why don't we hear about this stuff? We are being misinformed. There have been very well-funded think tanks, funded by the fossil fuel industry, for example, putting out bogus narratives. There is a lot of the media that is owned by nefarious billionaires who influence elections, they influence things like Brexit, they influence all kinds of stuff for their own vested interest and against the interests of the rest of humanity. So anybody who's on that social or traditional media, please get out and switch. A lot of my book, just to plug my book quickly, it just has some questions to ask about the media that you might be absorbing. And it says, if you are absorbing the wrong media, switch. There's a lot of media out there that some people think is respectable, and it isn't. And I've got some suggestions for what might be better media. Same for your politicians, same for the businesses that you invest in and spend money on.
Just to jump in, I know, Chloe, you want to say something, but just to jump in, all of those links will be in the show notes, and I will encourage anyone to click on that. As you've been speaking, I brought up that letter, and I'm going to be straight after this, making sure I get it signed and moved on. And also, if people think that idea of like almost conspiracy theory, that these media organizations are trying to influence them, just because Google Cambridge Analytica, there's a company that literally was put together to influence the outcome of elections, which it did do, and became, actually, it was criminal and got shut down. So this is not hyperbole, or this is not a conspiracy theory. This is the reality of the world that we currently live in.
And it's got worse since then. Cambridge Analytica, all that stuff there, that dates back nearly a decade now.
Is it? Oh, God.
Yep. But things have not got less sophisticated in that time, right? X and Facebook, their algorithms are seriously poisonous. And UK media, I'll call some of it out. The Daily Mail had a headline recently saying that it would cost the UK $4.5 trillion or something to be net zero by whenever. What a complete load of rubbish. There's been this narrative about poorer and colder if we do an energy transition. It's not true. We'll be richer and warmer, and this robust evidence, it couldn't be clearer, but we're being missold it. Please, anybody who absorbs media, social or traditional media, that is owned by a nefarious billionaire with a track record of having done bad things, that's all you need to know. Please get out and switch. You can make up your own mind about what the alternatives are. I've got various suggestions in one of the appendices of my book, but please switch, otherwise you're being abused.
And on the theme of misinformation, one of the narratives that I find particularly concerning is this kind of, I guess they call it like the green capitalism, or the kind of technical solutions. So this idea that we'll just apply some technology, whether it's carbon capture or enough renewable, and that will solve the problem. And I feel that keeps us in that mindset of exploiting our power. Essentially, we'll just find this technical, progressive way, and that will get us out of the problem, and that will also lead to continual progression of society, which I would question whether technology has enabled that, full stop. But I suppose I wonder about that particular narrative, and how do we help people move away from it? Because it's quite a comfortable one, this idea, we'll just find a technical solution, and we don't need to make any other changes.
Yeah, so techno optimism is how I would describe it. I think it's one of the most depressing things, actually. It's not that we don't need some of the right technologies, they can really help us, right? And because the existence of the right technologies and the possibility to develop them, that lets us know that we can transition, for example, to the energy transition, without any suffering at all. And in fact, it's an opportunity for us, but it's not enough. We've been developing new technology to make us more efficient at everything you can think of for a very long time now. And while we do that, our impact on the planet has been going up, not down. And the reason for that is that we deploy all our technologies for a mixture of good purposes and bad purposes. So we become more efficient with our energy supply, and we use some of that to do good things, and we use some of it to do unnecessary new things. So if you look, for example, at our energy supply, since 1995, when we had the first climate COP, we have grown our at the global level, we've grown the non-fossil energy supply by about 250%. Isn't that wonderful? It is wonderful until you see that at the same time, we have grown our fossil energy supply by about 60%, and we're continuing to grow it. And the climate doesn't care how much renewable energy we've got. It only cares how little fossil fuel we burn. So, one of the interesting questions, I think, for all people looking at this and all businesses and so on, is to ask, how deep do we need to go into the system in order to get the change that will work? Is it a question of sticky plasters around the outside, put up some new wind turbines and some solar panels, and develop AI to enable some efficiency improvements, in all elements of the economy? And will that be enough? It doesn't take you long to see that's not enough, because the trouble is we will have the renewables as well as more fossil fuel, and the AI will power so much more activity in the global economy, and all that's going to take energy, and all the renewable energy that's used to power data centers is renewable energy that can't be used elsewhere in the economy. So one way or another, the whole thing spirals out of control, unless we start doing some other things about how we run the economy, what kind of growth we pursue, what sort of constraints we put on environmental impacts. I mean, if you look at the climate dimension of this, all roads lead to something like a carbon price. If we don't constrain the fossil fuel coming out of the ground, no amount of renewable energy will take away our appetite for having yet more energy. And I think that's one of those kind of pieces of just naive wishful thinking, which the evidence is very clearly against. I mean, there are smart, well-intentioned people who are still punting that narrative that if we just have more renewables, that's what we need to do. It's not enough just to do good things. We have to constrain the bad things as well. The same goes for AI. It's not enough to be able to say, oh, AI can be used for good things. You also have to be able to say, and it won't be used for bad things. And that's an extremely challenging question. So is that an answer to your question, Chloe? How deep? And what do I say to people who, the techno optimists, I mean, they're just, unfortunately, it's a very unhelpful narrative.
And I guess it feeds into that greater challenge as well of how do we shift mindsets? And obviously our minds are a product of our evolutionary psychology. So there's certain things around us wanting power and status and influence and wanting to hoard our resources because those were the things that would have kept us safe historically. And obviously our mindsets are also a product of the system around us. So as we're developing in the context of capitalism and in a certain way, and that will inform how we think. So it's such a challenge to help us to make adjustments in how we perceive the world and what we consider is important and how we work together. So I suppose with that challenge, what ideas do you have about what is getting most critical in helping us to adjust things, perhaps on that kind of individual level of mindset to help influence at the level of the system and at the level of the polycrisis?
That's a really good question. I'm going to start with some good news about humanity, because we hear all these stories about ourselves that we're fundamentally selfish and everybody's out for themselves and all the rest of it. And it's not true. The evidence from neuroscience and social history and everywhere you can think of, and epigenetics and all the rest of it, is saying we are capable of rewiring ourselves in the way that we need in order to thrive in the Anthropocene. We are capable of cultivating the values that we need in order to thrive. We are capable of fantastic cooperation. We now need to cooperate at a global level in a way that we've never managed to achieve before. We need to empathize with each other. We need to collaborate. We need to fundamentally cooperate rather than compete. It's okay to compete for sport and stuff like that and for fun, but at the end of the day, all of us need to identify fundamentally with the global tribe. We're all in this, and we're capable of it. We're capable of being really nasty to each other, but we're capable of being really nice to each other. And we're capable of cultivating that collective value. And so we need to get off our butts and do it now. Right? So And when people say, well, all people are greedy, and people talk about politics and they say, well, all politicians lie, it's just how the world works. It's not true. It doesn't need to be true. But if we're going to make it cooperative, and we're going to push kind and empathetic politicians to the top, then we need to do it deliberately. We need to ask different questions of what makes a good politician. And I think, if I ever was going to write another book, but I'd love it if somebody else wrote this book instead. So this is an invitation to all your listeners, right? We need to get better at getting the right people into powerful positions. Yes, they need to be smart, but most of all, they need to be honest, and they need to be, to use a very simple word, they need to be kind. They need to care about other people. Right? They need to have empathy. At the moment, far too often, we allow psychopaths, by which I mean people without empathy, to rise to very powerful positions. They can be charismatic, they can be funny, they understand how to do appealing narratives if they're smart. They sometimes have interesting haircuts. And we fall for it.
Yeah.
Collectively, we fall for it. And we need to wise up. We need to really wise up. We need to ask ourselves, what is the criteria that we are using for judging that we'd like this person to be an MP or a Prime Minister? What is the criteria we're using for asking whether we want to be absorbing this newspaper? Who owns it? What do we know about the ownership of this? Is it owned by people who care about the world? Is it set up in a way that cares about the world? What about the businesses? If you spend money on, if you buy something online just because it's the cheapest and easiest way of buying it, but actually you're buying it from an organization that is owned by a billionaire who is doing things, if you look carefully, is doing things that aren't good for the planet and aren't good for the people who live on the planet, then if you can possibly afford to, find a way of switching. And if you can't afford to, then at least recognize that you are bonded into a system that you're feeling unable to escape from. In which case I would say, you're like a slave. So do what you can to engineer your freedom.
I mean, everything you say makes sense to me. And, Chloe and I have war gamed out what needs to change and should we try and become an MP? But when you go through kind of, you war game out those processes, firstly, the whole process of becoming MP is, if you want to become one of the major political parties, is so elongated. And then even when you get to a position, let's say you've volunteered for a number of years locally, then you get promoted to local council, and then you volunteer again. And it's almost a position of privilege for starters before you even get to getting voted. And then once you're in Parliament, you may not be in position of power and therefore can't influence. So it's a long process to get to a point where you may not have a big enough influence. And then secondly, do you think the political system is set up to allow people to be honest and trustworthy? And my wargaming is if I ran to be local MP, I'd have to be truthful. And if I was truthful, how many votes would I get?
The current system, including the culture, doesn't make it easy. You've got to cultivate some pretty good characteristics if you're going to survive and thrive in that environment. And, it's easier to become an MP if you've got a stack of money behind you, but it's not impossible if you haven't. So, I agree with you. We don't have a system that's set up to encourage the best politicians at all. And first past the post is terrible for all this. There's an appendix in the back of my book about simple changes to the UK political system. But I do think it is possible, and there are some examples of that. So, my work is, tries to be cross-party. I don't have any firm political affiliations, and the principles that I talk about should apply absolutely, transcend party politics. But I do think, I'll just say it, I do think Zach Blansky right now has got off to a pretty good start in many ways. And in fact, I was talking to him the day before yesterday and asking him, what is he putting in place and what can his party put in place to protect him from the kind of degradation that we so often see, I think, in politicians when they've been in place for a while, and in that culture where people are shouting at each other and everybody's polarizing and there's so many populists and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, at the moment, he's pretty good at saying things, I think, at saying things like they are, reframing arguments that need reframing. When he's asked a question, he's quite good at giving his honest answer to the question rather than doing a sort of load of calculations or how's this going to land? Who should I say to what? Right? Which and ends up with some kind of meaningless fudge coming out the other end.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that will get harder for him. And so I was asking him, I've been saying, well, if you were a therapist working in an environment where you were with people who weren't always behaving in healthy ways, weren't always thinking in healthy ways, which I think that is how Parliament is at the moment. If you were a registered therapist in some way, you would have to have supervision. Your institution would insist that you were supervised. It would insist that you had at least a period of time every now and again, every week or whatever, where you stand back from it and you have a dedicated hour where you're reflecting what's going on, what are your emotions like, what's your thought processes like, what do you need to keep your perspective. And I actually think he would do very well to think very carefully about setting that up now in order to preserve and develop his best qualities.
I think that's a really interesting point, Mike. And I think having, as a trained therapist myself, you obviously spend a lot of time supervision of it. So my background is in clinical psychology, and you spend a lot of time in that spaces where you grow, and also where you're aware of all the powerful forces that are pushing you around, and that you recognize the need to attune to your values that are driving your practice. And I think that question that we ask ourselves is a really critical one around what is pushing me around right now and where I want to actually move towards. And I was thinking about the role and community of that, because I think when you find people that share a similar value set to yourself, and when you get into conversation with them, whether that's over a cup of tea in a book club, whether that's going for a walk together, whatever it might be, those are perhaps those little moments, little micro moments of supervision where you can help identify what are the powerful forces that are pushing me around, and what do I want to commit to. So it doesn't perhaps need to be I think politicians are having some supervision would be fantastic, but perhaps on an everyday level, maybe what we need to move towards is community spaces that encourage that way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think, it's something, I try and work on as well. We need to spend time surrounded by people who are trying to think in the kind of ways that we are trying to think ourselves. We need to support each other in this. And I think I would, invite listeners to this podcast to ask themselves that question. Can they surround themselves with people who will support them in that kind of thinking? Because it is really important. It's very hard to do this stuff alone. So, think about our friends and families. And, it's every time we find ourselves in an environment that is just thinking in unhealthy ways, it leaks into us. A few years ago, I did a talk at a Shell conference. And I had to stand straight after their chief executive, Ben van Beurden, at the time. And I just had to say, look, everything you've just been hearing from your chief executive is a load of rubbish. I mean, it was weird. And they came up to me at the end and said, oh, thank you. We love to be challenged. And it was like, this is insane. And I remember leaving that conference, and it was held at a racetrack, and they'd put me up in this room that wasn't a room. They gave me like a suite of rooms. It was just it was insane. I was just like, all I want is a bed, Anyway, I did it, and after my talk, and I had a lunch with them and stuff, and I remember cycling out of the place and just feeling relief to get out of that environment, because it felt so ill. It felt psychologically ill. And it does us in, being in those sorts of environments. And many of us go to work in environments that are like that. Or we have clients, I have a consultancy, we have clients that, sometimes we're in unhealthy. And you have to find a way, of best we can, of putting ourselves in environments and with people who help us to cultivate the characteristics that we want.
Thank you so much, Mike, for all your wisdom and insight that you've shared in the conversation so far. There is so much that I need to take away and reflect on from what you said, and lots of perhaps implicit calls to action. But I just wanted to offer a final reflection, perhaps, before we perhaps think about what the more tangible calls to action might be. You talked about the need for courage, and how we perhaps need to, with that courage, tolerate some of the discomfort associated with change. And having worked with lots of people therapeutically, I know that when we have to change, there's always going to be both kind of internal barriers to making that change. And I was trying to connect that into this idea of opportunity. So recognizing that with these changes that we're working towards, we're going to have improved well-being, better food, more natural spaces, reduced inequality. And how do we help people hold on to the optimism associated with this opportunity in order to help them tolerate the discomfort of the change?
Yeah. Okay. So when I say there's everything to play for, the difference between waking up and not waking up is huge, right? So if we don't wake up, we're careering into an incredibly uncomfortable place. We're careering into fascism, probably. It's another dimension we haven't even talked about. If we can wake up on this, there's such an opportunity to live better, right? To have more meaningful jobs, to pursue things that are fundamentally more meaningful for humanity. We can pursue the things that are important to us. It's not fast cars and bigger houses and new trainers. There are other things that can actually do a much better job of improving our well-being, like the quality of our relationships and doing work that's truly meaningful to us, and all sorts of things like this. And you two have been on that journey of transitioning in some ways what you do. And, it takes courage. And, and I've done that kind of thing a couple of times in my life as well, make quite big transitions. And I don't know anybody who ever goes on that journey and looks back on and thinks, oh, I wish I'd just stuck with the day job. But it does take some courage. And, I'm inviting everybody listening to this to try to be brave in situations, to say what needs saying, because we've got to break the paradigm a bit. We've got to snap out of a rut that we're in collectively. And everyone who does this makes it so much easier for everybody else. And actually, it will feel so exciting. I think, as we wake up to this, we will feel so much more alive. So maybe, I don't know if this is too corny, but to think of ourselves on our deathbeds and looking back on what kind of lives we had and the decisions we did or didn't make. And when we knew this was happening, how would we want to react? And just remember, we are not alone. I wish I could put everybody in front of all the situations in which I've asked people to raise their hands, just ordinary people. Sometimes it's bias groups, but very often it's just ordinary cross sections of business communities or whatever. Everybody raises their hand. They get it. So we're just waiting for everybody else. It's who's got the courage? Who are the people who can put up their hand and say, hang on a minute, the emperor's not wearing any clothes on this one. I think there's a bit of a disconnect going on. And then everybody else goes, oh, great. I've been quietly thinking that as well. Thank God we can talk about this now. And think of the favor you're doing for everyone else. Think how much everyone else will appreciate you having done it. Now is a really critical moment. And then just one very tangible thing. So go to the nebriefing.org website, sign the letter and so on, but also we're making a film of the briefing, and we're going to turn the film into events up and down the country, which will show the film, but also have discussions and galvanize action and be about transforming local communities and contributing to the national and international systemic change that we need. And anybody listening can be part of, start thinking about how could they start a group? How can they lay on, maybe you can get in touch with a venue. It's all going to need organizing at the local level, and listeners can be involved in that.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for your time. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is probably one of, if not the most important interview that we've had on the podcast so far. And thank you for the way that you've communicated it. It's been just absolutely clear, inspiring, and informative in equal measures.
Well, thank you. I love what you're doing. I've said this to Chloe already. I love what you're doing. I'd love to find a way of calling in sometime and see more about it. Yeah,
please do.
Before we get into the analysis, the deeper, darker side of that conversation, I just want to mention and put my hands up to say that I absolutely butchered most of my questions during that interview. I think I was just kind of intimidated, overexcited, and I think what Mike said after the garbage that I threw at him was fantastic. And I really appreciate his ability to make me sound more intelligent than I was in that conversation. But I just wanted to acknowledge that wasn't my best interviewing on the podcast.
I wonder if it is slightly related to the fact that he has played quite a big role in us, making the decision to buy the farm here and to go through the process of setting up the Grange Project. He has been one of those really influential figures in our journey.
Yeah, and he's really disarming because he's such a nice man and comes across extremely genuine. Felt like I was down the pub just spouting words at my mate until I had to remind myself he's like one of the eminent leading figures in the space as a professor and an absolutely fantastic man. So yeah, anyway, thank you, Mike, for being so kind to A, to give us the time, but also B, to decipher my machine gun effect? I asked two completely separate questions and just in the same question.
It's okay, Tom. It's fine. Mike, as you say, saved the day. And what he does so eloquently is be able to describe. I suppose what I'm trying to say is there's not many people that are able to hold that zoomed out picture, but also have enough detail behind the evidence to be confident in that picture. Because there could have been 20 podcast topics covered in that interview, everything zoomed in from the energy system through to the climate anxiety we experience. He somehow is able to draw them all together and knit them into a picture, which many people aren't just able to hold that. There's many ideas in their head.
Does make me think we should do a mini series on all the different polycrisis, the ones we haven't covered already. They go make a lot of sense, wouldn't it, to dig deeper?
And then it's like, what level do you just, because there's obviously the polycrisis, then there's the systems that underpin the polycrisis, and then there's the inner world underneath that. Like, you've probably got never mind a mini series, you've got another 50 episodes.
I'm just trying to keep us in podcast, Chloe, all right? This is we're there. We've got hundreds of years worth of content. And then by the time we finish, we'll go back and update the new ones.
One of the questions I've been grappling with, both since that interview, and I think mostly because you and I have a slightly different perspective on this, is around the role of education. And
do we? Go on then. I like this. This is going to be awesome.
I don't want to say what your belief is, but perhaps there is a belief that's held that just the problem is around lack of education. And if people only understood the predicament that we're in, that they would make conscious choices to live in a different way or to take action or to challenge. So we just need to educate people more and then they'll make those choices. But I have a feeling that is part of it. Of course, information is part of it. But I also have a feeling that there are so many other barriers towards people being able to really, you can understand the information on a cognitive level, but really engaging with your heart in a way that's going to drive forward change, I think is quite a different task than just giving people information.
I couldn't agree more.
I'm quite surprised at that.
I think you're conflating two conversations. I think one is, about nature literacy. And I think that's super important. I think that if people are more literate in nature, then I think that would drive pro-environmental and nature-based. I think that, I believe, is the biggest. But I think when we're talking about something as complex as the polycrisis, I think just suggesting that if we just machine gun facts at somebody, they're going to make changes, I think is not accurate at all.
So what do you think are the barriers then towards people not being able to take action on the face of information?
Even that question, I think, is complicated. What do you mean by information? Are they being taught it on a 4-year doctorate or a 6-year doctorate? Are they just being sent all the information on slide decks? Are they being engaged in a constructive way? Like that, I can't answer that question without a bit more clarification, dear.
Okay, let's use the National Emergency Briefing as an example.
Oh, I love that, yeah.
So that was a series of 10 people, wasn't it? Speaking for 10 minutes, covering the headlines of their particular area of specialism. That has then been shared broadly as a result. How do you think that generates change?
Again, really complicated thing to be able to act on, multifaceted, ranging from the people that they had there. They had the famous people with the social media reaches and the kind of the money and the wealth and the influence there. Then they had the MPs there, I think 80 or whatever it was, he said. Again, that's going to happen. This is going to happen every single year, hopefully, or every other year. So that will increase, that number will increase. And then as they're making the film, they're trying to get it out more broadly. So I think that this is step one in a much broader journey of starting to really communicate the complexities in a way that people want to hear. People don't want to sit down, I say people more broadly, more generalists, and sit down in a 2-hour lecture about a thing that's not relevant to them. What we've got to do, and what they're doing so beautifully, is distilling that down into bite-sized chunks in a way that people consume information these days in a way that's relevant to them and make it relevant to them. This is not the golden bullet or the silver bullet, whatever the term is. This is not going to solve everything. It's just one of the many things we need to do in order to drive change.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable response.
And by the way, listeners, I'm sure you would have taken this away, but they are fantastic. So I highly, highly recommend just spending a time watching them, making yourself sit down for each one, because sometimes it's hard to watch, hard to listen, hard to understand. For me, I found it useful because my brain can't hold it all in my head at once. So having someone consolidate it down into 10-minute snippets, it reminds me why we're doing what we're doing, and it allows me to build kind of drive and determination to try and create change myself.
Another point I was particularly interested in was Mike's stat about the number of people that raise their hands when he says, do you believe this to be true? And do you believe us to have perhaps under-exaggerated some of the risks?
You'd be a brave person in front of Mike to put their hand, but his point still stands.
I think it does. And certainly that reflects my lived experience, that when I have conversations with friends and family who perhaps are not as fully signed up to the journey that we've been on, most people aren't providing me with coherent ideas as to how things are functioning really well and actually society's going great and there's so much to celebrate and why are you worried about things? I'm not hearing that story. I'm hearing agreement broadly. We all share the concern. And in some ways it feels quite easy for people to point out some of the problems of the system. I think, again, it comes down to where do people feel agency to be able to generate change?
Yeah, I could come back to that. But from what you just said, my hypothesis of those people you're talking about, I don't think they fully understand the true predicament we're in. They've got a GCSE or an A-level understanding of the ice caps melting, seawater rise. It's not the wide-angled, so what's through a third, fourth, fifth order effects of everything intermingling and happening at the same time. So I think that, you and I are still probably not articulate enough to be able to communicate that to people.
So does that then go back to our early discussion that you think if they understood the so what through the sharing of information in a way that's accessible to them, that they would then feel more compelled to take action?
I can't imagine anyone not. If you understood it, if you truly understood the impacts on our family, literally this generation, but our kids' generations and beyond, if you truly, truly understood that, how could you then go, cool, yeah, can we put Coronation Street on?
I wonder, though, if it's necessary but not sufficient.
I'm not saying, but at no point have I ever said that that is the only thing we should do.
Okay, fair enough. I stand corrected. But I do feel like we need more examples, stories, opportunities for people to see how, for them, in their context, they can make steps towards a change that feels possible. Otherwise, you do get this kind of learned helplessness paralysis of the information is so overwhelming, the system is so powerful, there's misinformation everywhere, and the decisions are all being made by someone that has completely opposing beliefs to I do about how the world even operates. Then how can we make any change?
I agree. And I think this comes back to my hypothesis around the different types of people in the world and groups of people in the world. And you and I are different in that way. And the type of information that drives you to make changes and want to enact positive good are different to what drives me and makes me want to do something differently. So I think we've just got to, this sector historically has been too safe in the way it communicates information, in my opinion. Too safe in the way that the people that produce it, they make it for themselves really, and they're consumed by themselves, and that's what works for them in that group. But there's a whole other sectors that aren't being touched by the natural environmental information or agenda, for lack of a much better term, that we really need to start touching. And that means we're going to have to start producing content that is uncomfortable for the old guard, but more comfortable, more engaging and more relevant for the new people that haven't been touched or engaged by this historically.
When I met with Mike for our introductory call to set up for the interview, he asked a question. He said, what made Tom and you take this decision? Because I'm really interested in that, because obviously you've kind of turned over your entire lives to try and generate some change. So what were the ingredients that empowered you to do that? Do you have any idea what I said?
It was probably different for both of us.
I did say that.
Obviously, our children, having to think beyond, and privilege of having money in the bank so we can put our head above the parapet.
Yep.
It's like a test. And your husband's really inspiring, and therefore you just do everything he says.
I mean, I didn't frame it quite like that. But I did say that it is your courage, really, and persistence that pushed me in a way that I probably wouldn't have taken those uncomfortable decisions at the time. I'm so glad we have done now. But 7 years ago, when I was quite happily plodding away in the NHS, thinking I was influencing that sphere, and to be fair, having trained for quite a number of years to get to that position, for me to now be doing very different things, whether it's gardening or hosting away days or developing fundraising plans, it's amazing how we needed, as a system, we needed your courage and your entrepreneurial mindset to be able to make those changes. So I think it was an interesting question for Mike to ask, but I do think it is going to be so unique for every person. But I do feel like we need stories of hopeful action. And I'm just going to give a little plug. And this has been a very long post-analysis, but I think just to finish off, because I found this incredibly useful over the last few weeks. But I'm going to plug another podcast, which I think is doing a fantastic job of exactly this. And I've been recommending it to everyone. It's called Screw This, Let's Try Something Else. And each episode covers a story of a community that has done something different, whether it's setting up a wind turbine in your community, buying houses to rent back into the local people, whether it's setting up a greengrocers funded by a market garden, or creating a whole new way of dealing with politics. They're really inspiring stories of hopeful people making change. And most of them just start with a few people around the kitchen table with a cup of tea. And they're beautifully produced, the episodes. They're really engaging. They're really informative. And they just leave you feeling really hopeful about the grassroots change that's happening in the world.
Should we wrap up?
Yeah.
I just want to say before we wrap up, if you have found this useful or interesting or enlightening, then if there's anyone else that you think could benefit from this, then please don't be shy, please do share this episode more broadly. Let's get people understanding about the Polycrisis, but more importantly, or as importantly, about national emergency briefing as well, and the actions that you can take as an individual in order to drive some positive change in the world, which we do need these days. Also, if you're in a safe space and you want to stop and just quickly go into whatever podcast app you're listening on and rate and review the Wilder podcast, it is super helpful in helping us build the awareness, build the reach of the platform, and again, all part of that driving positive change. Well, I hope you found this episode really, really enlightening as much as we enjoyed recording it. Next episode is going to be a full update about the Grange Project and where we've got to, one of our benchmarks episodes. Something to look forward to.
Absolutely.
Let's go.